good afternoon, depending on when and where you are watching this. I'm so happy to be with you. I'm Nayaswami Asha. We are continuing with our study of the book, The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. I have a little bit of makeup work to do here, and I believe the last time I recorded, I wanted to quote the prayer of the Ananda Sangha, which is something that Swamiji wrote in 2003, right after he moved to India. And for some reason I couldn't get the words right, so I want to say it exactly correctly. May the divine light awaken and purify my heart and bring enlightenment to all beings. It was very dear when Swami wrote that. It was after he moved to India, as I was saying, in 2003, which is 45 years after he was building Ananda, longer than that. When he went to India, he felt it was time to write out the principles upon which Ananda was based, and he wrote a small flyer called The Way of Ananda Sanghis, and it had about 7 points, I think, that we believe. We publish it now on the Ananda Palo Alto website under called What We Believe. If you haven't read it elsewhere, it's really a beautiful summary of what it means to be on the spiritual path as we understand it. I don't know if we believe is exactly right, but it's the principles by which we live and the ideals that inspire our life. And part of that, when writing that, Swami wrote that prayer, may the divine light awaken and purify my heart and bring enlightenment to all beings. And it really describes the essence of what it means to be on the spiritual path. So now back to the Bhagavad Gita. We are finishing up what is chapter 8 of the commentary, but we always want to remind you that this is not, these chapters, the chapter numbers in the book do not correspond to the chapter numbers in the Gita, because we are still on verse 1, the early stanzas, chapter 1, of the Gita, the early verses. Swamiji doesn't go stanza by stanza until a little bit into the second chapter of the Gita. So now we're just doing it in a more general way. Pretty soon the verses themselves begin to appear in the book. I stopped the last class not quite at the end of chapter 8 of the book, because we had come to that part, which we deal again with later, where Duryodhana is looking at the armies and Arjuna is looking at the armies of both sides. And we say that the forces for error are innumerable, that Duryodhana's forces are uncountable, and Arjuna's forces, the Pandavas, are easily counted. And Swami gives an explanation of this, which I've heard before, but somehow I understood it more, and I want to pass that on. He tries to explain that if you think of spiritual life, which is a very dynamic way to think of it, as all of us arrayed on the rim of a wheel, like a bicycle tire, because it has lots of spokes into the center, and then there's the hub of the wheel, and the whole wheel spins from the hub, but the movement of the hub is very different than the movement on the rim, and also the circumference of the rim is much wider than the hub, or even the center point of the hub. And in a very real sense, the eternal now and our attunement with it and our attunement with the presence of God, of course, everything emanates from the center. We tend to think of the spiritual path sometimes as linear, which is there's the goal and here I am and I walk toward it. And that leads to all sorts of sense, a very narrow sense of possibility. It also leads to comparison, because we're looking on a linear plane. He's ahead of me and he's behind me. And our sense of measurement and even understanding of what progress is can become very confused, which is an issue that is also being dealt with here in this first stanza of the Bhagavad Gita, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it's much more accurate to think that we are all arrayed at various distances from the center point, and the center point is divine realization, and we move away from center like this, as if the center point expands, which in fact is exactly the image that Satchidananda manifests itself into creation, so that center point expands into these rays or spokes, and we're projected away from our center out to the edge. And so we're at different distances. If you think of yourself on the spoke somewhere, you're making a different circumference around the center. Circumference, is that what I mean? You're taking making a different route around the center. And so those who are closer, you have many concentric circles. Concentric circles is what I wanted to say. Those who are very materialistic and very distant are still circulating around that center point of spirit, because it's impossible not to. All of us are both pulling away from spirit in the sense of our worldly desires are taking us away from our own center, and we're also entirely connected to spirit because our own divinity will never let us go. And so we move out into gross materialism, and then we begin to become more subtle in our understanding and more spiritual in our awareness, but we haven't merged, but we've moved a little bit closer to spirit, a little farther away from pure materialism, and then we keep shrinking that circle of separation until finally we merge like this. Another way is to think of it we come down an individual spoke and we get closer and closer to the center. Now, the way Swamiji is talking about the ways of delusion are innumerable and the ways of spirit are many, is also, here's another aspect of it, which is, are few. The ways of spirit are few, the ways of delusion are innumerable. Swamiji made a very interesting statement once in the middle of a satsang. As it happened, the satsang was at his house in Gurgaon. I had just arrived from America, and that evening he gave a satsang for all the ashram residents. And in the course of it, he made the statement, which is often made, that delusion is complex, God is simple. And he elaborated on it just a little bit more by saying, because delusion or creation is so complex, I'm sitting here recording this, speaking to you all from California. Many of you are watching this in India. Last week I was in New York City and in Boston. Later this year I'll go to Los Angeles. I'm also planning to go to New Zealand. Many people travel all over the world. A group of friends from India were recently at our home in California. Now they've gone to another part of California. All of these many, many individuals that we see in every location, all the cultures and circumstances and languages and possibilities and different nuances of consciousness and the aspiration of each individual. Well, I could go on, and I haven't even, I haven't even hinted at how complex creation is. So the natural thought Swamiji was putting forth is that we think that the creator of all of this complexity must himself be the most complex of all. That in order to keep all these widgets in line, he must have such a filing system and such a reality of it. But Swamiji said the actual truth of spirituality is completely different. I'll give you one more image, which is, they say that from the point of stillness, spirit being absolute stillness, it vibrates. It begins to vibrate. And that the vibration is Om, that vibration is the divine light. And as long as it's vibrating, as long as spirit is in motion, then the dance of Shiva goes on. The creation continues to exist. The dance of Divine Mother goes on. Shiva dissolves it, but the dance of Divine Mother goes on. And that's why everything is dual, because it's vibration, like this. And as we get closer to the spirit, we actually become more and more still. That's how we feel it inside ourselves. In the Old Testament it says, "Be still and know that I am God." because in that inner stillness, suddenly we know. Now, vibration, by definition, is a lot happening. It covers all of this distance, so to speak, whether that's the distance of sound or light waves or physical material distance, flying on airplanes from one end of the world to the other, all of these gradations of vibration being manifest as different levels of consciousness that people express. But the less vibration there is, the fewer variations there are on the theme. Either the vibration is so still that the duality is almost imperceptible, or the vibrations absolutely cease. And we know ourselves and all of creation to be divine. So what Swami was saying in that satsang about creation is complex, but the closer we get to God, the more and more simple we become. Not simple-minded, but divine simplicity, in which everything is clear to us because there's no conflicting cross currents of delusion or of ego. That's why Jesus said, "Suffer little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven," because of the simplicity of little children. I'm recording this on a summer day. We're almost to the summer solstice here in California on the day that I'm recording this. And I was remembering a friend of mine talking about what was really a divine experience that she had as a child, but it also is that beautiful simplicity of a child. She talked about waking up in the morning when she was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and it was summer vacation. She didn't have to go to school, and just slipping out of her bed in her bare feet in her little pajamas, and just going into the backyard, maybe at 5 in the morning, and just standing barefoot on the grass, and just feeling the simple freedom of summer for a child. Just nothing had to be done. The world was quiet. Everything belonged to the child in that moment. And such a divine revelation, even in childhood, is often the seed of wanting to get back to that as an adult. Swami Kriyananda described his early years, up until about the age of 9, of a state of ecstatic personal freedom. He lived more in the astral world than in this world. He would merge at night when he would go to sleep, he would merge into a divine light. Around the age of 9, certain more challenging karmas set in, starting with his body became very physically ill. He had high fevers and went into a state of delirium, which was a bit frightening for him at periods of time, which left him, he said, with a residual fear of altered states of consciousness, so he began to withdraw a little bit from the light. It was the period of necessary tapasya that he had to go through before, at the age of 22, he found his guru. But he said in those intervening years, especially his late teens and the first couple of years of his 20s, he said he remembered the simple freedom of being a child, and he felt the bondage of the intellectual complexity he had built up around himself in the later years of his growing up, and he longed for that simple freedom of childhood again. Now, of course, the freedom of spirit is not childish. One of the reasons children are so free is because they are unaware. They don't yet know. They don't have to take responsibility. They don't have to really take on the destiny, work out the karma for which they were born. Children, it's kind of like a very brief free ride. You get to step out of the karmic necessities just briefly. And then when you're about the age of 12, the ego begins to come in, and then you really have to face whatever it is you have to face. Now, all of these images come back to what I was saying about Swami saying, spirit is simple. And we need to remember that and keep it simple within ourselves. Now, this is what the Gita, the next morning, I just wanted to finish this thought. The next morning after that satsang, there had been 40 or 50 people in the room, and I was just probably alone with Swami, just having breakfast. And he said, what I said last night was deeply important. He said, I hope people understood how profoundly important that is, which is that as we get closer and closer to Spirit, everything simplifies. And it simplifies for the reasons that, here now we go back to the Gita, because when we're closer to the Spirit, we are calm, we have faith in God, we have an expanded heart. The last time I was speaking, the episode before this one, I was talking about the signs of a true spiritual development, expansion of sympathy for everyone in the world, increasing calmness, expanding sense of joy and freedom. See, all of those make life very simple, especially the expanding sympathy. Or let me speak of the expanding sympathy. When you love other people and you have this ability because of a sense of unified consciousness with them, then other people are transparent to you. It's not difficult to understand them, nor is it difficult to know how to respond, nor is it difficult to love them. It's not an effort of will to overcome all the minute reasons why you do and you don't like this person. In America, there's this phrase, it's the infatuation with personal psychology, which perhaps is Western, not just American. A man used to say to Swamiji often that he had a lot of stuff he had to process. Those were the words he would use. Sometimes we use slang and don't really hear how it sounds. This is a digression, but words have vibrations, and slang has vibrations. I'm sure in all languages it has vibrations. And those vibrations are not usually refined or exact in what they mean or uplifting, even if the slang is not vulgar. It's just not elegant. And Swami Kriyananda just never uses slang. Very, very rarely. And whenever he does it deliberately. And it's when he uses a slang phrase, it's interesting because the contrast in vibration is so noticeable from the language that he normally uses that one realizes that it's not uplifting to consciousness to use those words. So this friend would often say he had a lot of stuff to process, which if you think about that, and this is exactly what Swami said, what could he possibly mean? And what Swami means by that, what that person means is all this complexity of delusion, what I think, what I feel, who did what to me, why I want to do this, where I'm going, what I want, what I don't want. All this stuff you have to process. But for the devotee, it gets very simple. I love God. And if I love God and am in the stillness, He tells me what to do. I can follow my intuition. Now, the manifestation of that, I have to say, because I lived with Swami closely associated with Swami so closely for all those decades, that simplicity results in a subtle brilliance that the rest of us flailing about on the rim of the wheel could just never come to. Sometimes there would be situations in the community, running the community in one way or another. And we're competent people and well-trained. But sometimes we just could not figure out how to accommodate everybody's karmic needs, how to really be loyal to everyone as a friend, when so often at the edge of the wheel, things just didn't seem to come together. But Swamiji always had a way of just picking a situation up from the right string, often bringing in ideas that no one else had considered, and he would often do it just effortlessly, because from the center of the wheel, you can see you're equidistant from every point. And so every point is equally clear. From the rim of the wheel, you can only see what's available to you. You can't see even what's on the other side. And so the closer you are to the center, the more you can see of everything. Even if you're not all the way at the main point, you're your triangle of vision is much greater. So in the Gita, all of this is to say, in the Gita it says that the Kauravas were innumerable and the Pandavas were just a few. And that makes it look like, from the point of view of materialism, that, that the Pandavas don't have much to go on. But the points, the power that they have is being at the turning point. The whole wheel turns from the center. And so you don't need a great deal if you're at the turning point of the whole reality. If you can turn in any direction, and as I say, be equidistant from all of it. And the realm also, it just can expand out infinitely. And so as Swamiji says, using the example he said of hate, you can hate so many different things. And the more you hate, and the more specifically you hate, and the more you like and you don't like, the more the world continues to fragment. And the more all those fragments all have to be, they all turn into stuff that you have to process. But the more you love, the more everything looks the same to you. And the more everything looks like you. And it creates unity and simplicity rather than fragmentation and confusion. And in the end, of course, in the story of the Mahabharata, of which the Gita really is not concerned with the battle of Kurukshetra in the historical sense, in the end, the Pandavas are sufficient. And there's another reason why the Pandavas are sufficient, which Swamiji, it comes into the next chapter, so I won't go there yet. But it's how Krishna came to be Arjuna's charioteer. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Well, no, actually, I'll talk about it now because it's so much a part of this. In the story of the Mahabharata, Krishna is driving the chariot for Arjuna. And the way that came about was when Duryodhana and Arjuna saw that they were going to go to war. They both wanted Krishna on their side. Now, he is the uncle to both of them because the spirit is everything. When Swamiji was in a difficult period and through legal means, he was being persecuted, seriously and viciously persecuted. And the attorney on the other side was startlingly unscrupulous, stunningly unscrupulous for individuals such as us who are to our core honorable. He was utterly dishonest, and he lied just about everything, just for the fun of it. He lied seriously about legal matters because the difficulty to trace down perjury is very hard in the American system. So if a lawyer is willing to risk it and doesn't have an internal sense of honor, then he can manipulate the system to quite an appalling degree. But this man seemed to take pleasure just simply in telling untruth. Actually, elsewhere in this book, Swami refers to it. It's a tamasic quality that enjoys telling lies simply because of the pleasure of the confusion that it causes for other people. And so this attorney would do things like pick up a random stack of paper and declare that this was a list of various things that he was going to use to show. And it was papers that had no relationship to what he was saying, or just where he had been that morning. He was a startlingly dishonorable person, but with a lot of energy. Evil genius is what I would call him. And Swamiji one day became quite inward. He withdrew. He became quite withdrawn because he was facing a spiritual test in his own mind, which is he didn't care, as he put it to Divine Mother, if his reputation was destroyed, even if his work was destroyed, if it was her will that it be so. But it was hard for him to understand how Divine Mother would allow such a dishonorable person to be the instrument of that destruction, if it was going to be destroyed, which of course in the end it was not at all. He was strengthened, in fact, by persecution. But Swamiji meditated very deeply, and as it happened, I stepped into his room thinking he wasn't even in his room when he was having this conversation with God. And there was such a profound sense of absolute inner stillness. But Swamiji said he prayed to Babaji, and the answer he received was enormous in its implications. Babaji did not comfort him in any particular way except by telling him this truth. Babaji said to Swamiji, and inwardly, Swami didn't describe it as a vision. Swami said, "Why are you letting this dishonorable man have so much power over me?" And Babaji said, "They are all my children." Which is that God loves us all equally. Whether we are living in honor or in dishonor, it's not God's love for us that changes. It's our ability to experience that love that changes when we are more or less in tune with Him. So when the time came for Duryodhana and Arjuna to go to battle, and they were drawing their allies to them, Krishna was the uncle to both of them because they were cousins. And so both Duryodhana and Arjuna sprinted to the palace where Krishna lived, and when they came in, Krishna was asleep. And Duryodhana sat, as that story is described, proudly at the head of Krishna's bed next to where his face was, where he was sleeping. And Arjuna, as the humble devotee, sat at the foot of Krishna's bed and knelt humbly there. So when Krishna woke up, and Duryodhana had arrived just a moment before Arjuna did. But when Krishna woke up, because Arjuna was sitting at his feet, he saw Arjuna first. But then he turned and then he saw Duryodhana. So now is a dilemma, because who gets to ask first? Because the one who reaches first, this was the code, gets to make the first request. So Krishna decided he would compromise, because Duryodhana was said to have arrived first, although Krishna was asleep and didn't know for sure, but Arjuna was the one he saw first. So he gave them a choice. He said, Duryodhana, this is what you can have. He said, you can have either all my armies, all my elephants, all my soldiers, all the weapons, everything that I have to conduct great war in a material sense. Krishna said, one of you can have all of that, and the other one can have just me. And then Krishna went on to say, I won't fight. I won't fight in the battle. I'll drive your chariot, but I won't fight at all. I won't pick up a weapon in the war. And then he said, because Arjuna arrived first, he saw him first, Arjuna got to choose first. Arjuna said, there's no question, Lord, I'll take you. I don't need anything. If I have you in my chariot, which is guiding my life, then I don't need anything else. And Duryodhana thought Arjuna was a fool, as usual, and he took the army and the elephants and the soldiers, and he was so pleased with what Krishna had given him, and Arjuna was so pleased with what Krishna had given him, because Krishna had given him himself. And the devotee realizes that if God is with you, then absolutely nothing else is required. And even then, the complexity, you see, material world thinks the more complex, the more I have, the more stuff, the more powerful. Devotee knows the closer I am to God, the more I have of absolutely everything. And so essentially the outcome of the war was decided as soon as that decision was made. Now, and the outcome of the inner battle is decided as soon as that decision is made. So now we have another part, and we're going back now to Dhritarashtra, talking to Sanjaya and asking for the report of the battle in the past tense, because Sanjaya represents the power of introspection. Introspection is how we can tell whether we're making spiritual progress or not. But as I was saying in the last session, in the heat of the psychological battle, it's not possible for us to be able to appraise the situation. If we had the detachment to stand back, it would be over. only after the battle is done. And so, let me just make sure I get this point right. Yes. Here's a very interesting point on the spiritual path also. So often, people try to figure out what is correct by spinning these big theories. What if, what if, what if, what if? If this were true, then that were true. Should I do this in this circumstance? But the Gita is telling us here that we can't really tell by theory. We can only judge the rightness or wrongness of an action by its effect. And this is one of the aspects of the Gita that's also really vitally important here, that it is not a theoretical scripture. It's not about ideas that we're going to argue about. It's about actually engaging in the battle and then having Sanjaya tell us, enlighten the blind mind as to what were the actual effects of our actions. And Swamiji says, are they universally beneficial? Do they expand our understanding and sympathies? Do they create inspiration? Do they offer hope? And these questions are not always easy to answer. And then he talks about anger in a righteous cause. It's not always apparent on the surface. Appearances can deceive. He said even a sweet and kindly demeanor can actually be just masking an effort to draw you into temptation. Master tells a story about a beautiful young woman who came to see him, and she really wanted to be alone with Master, and as soon as she was in a room with him, she began to emanate a kind of sexual magnetism and tried to tempt Master, seduce Master in the most blatant physical way. And Master was completely aware of her intention and so on, and he looked sternly at her and fiercely denounced her for what she was doing. And she burst into tears, and it turned out that she'd been infected with a disease because of her promiscuous way of living. A man had infected her, and now she had this hatred toward all men, and by seducing men, she was trying to infect as many of them as she could. What a terrible story. But she was doing that by looking beautiful and looking kind and using all the sweet smiles that kind of magnetism can draw upon. So it's not just by looking at the surface. Swami Kriyananda himself tells a story of when he was building Ananda and had been working extremely hard to generate the income to pay for the original parcel of land that was the starting point for all what is now a worldwide movement. And he was working as hard as he could, teaching classes all over the area around San Francisco, California, driving hours every night, from one city to another, teaching in different cities in order to earn the money. And he was, inching his way toward the purchase of this land. And then some unscrupulous, or I should say greedy, merchant saw the opportunity to try to grab the land from him and broke the agreement that Swami had with him for paying for materials and tried to seize the property. And Swamiji, he said, he was driving his car at that point and his hands were shaking. He was so determined that he had to overcome this latest threat to what he was trying to accomplish. And someone with him, dismayed by the intensity of Swami's commitment and the seeming agitation of his demeanor, because he was just so fierce about it. Oh, she said, come to my house and we'll have a cup of tea and you'll feel better. And Swami responded with just fierce rejection. He said, I don't care how I feel. What I have to decide is what I'm going to do about this. So we also have to understand that merely because energy becomes engaged, and even fierce, concentrated energy becomes engaged, that does not mean that we're not moving in the right direction spiritually. In fact, as we progress through the scripture, it's a war. And in the next stanzas, we'll be talking about this. The next verses, we're talking about Arjuna wanting to not have to go into this battle, thinking it would be more spiritual just to be nice. And Krishna, the whole Gita becomes Krishna telling him, you know, there are times when you must fight. You must fight even what you might say ruthlessly against delusion, not ruthlessly against other people, not closing your heart to people, but opening yourself to the necessity to defeat delusion, however it comes to you. Swamiji's, in the Christian Bible, there's a question, because when Jesus was walking the earth and was drawing his disciples to him, the context was Judaism at that time in the Jewish land where they lived, and in the capital city of Jerusalem, and the big temple where the Jewish faith was the epicenter of the Jewish faith. And there were many. Jesus was simply a rabbi of the Jewish faith when he started, and when he stopped too. It only became something separate after he died, and his disciples took it to another level of expression. But he was a Jewish rabbi, and there were many Jewish rabbis. And the nature of Judaism was and is, people dispute, have different points of view, different interpretations, and they have a hearty give and take discussion of what the sages and the prophets meant by this phrase or that phrase. I know the same tradition exists vibrantly in India. So Jesus was asserting, of course, with all the power of being an avatar, alternative interpretations of the traditions of the Jewish people. And then there were others who asserted yet other alternatives, and then those who opposed them, and so on. So the disciples naturally asked, how can you tell a true teaching from a false one? How can you tell a true prophet from a false one? And the answer Jesus gave was very simple. He said, a good tree gives good fruit, and a bad or broken tree gives bad fruit. By the fruits you shall know them. In other words, what actually happens when you follow this? And this is also the difference between being an engaged devotee on the path and a mere intellectual scholar who talks about the possible implications of this action or that action, or this ancient tradition or that ancient tradition. The devotee engages. The yogi engages. It's not enough for me to sort of theorize about these things. I need to experience it in my own life. I want to know not merely what might be arguably true, but actually what is true. My very brief college career cracked right on that very point. When I went to Stanford University for only 1 year, and in the first week I signed up for a class that was called Consciousness. It was a time when these new ideas were coming into America, and I thought that would just be a wonderful class to take. I was just beginning to understand that consciousness was everything, that if we shifted our inner consciousness, then the whole world was different. In a way, I guess it's learning that if you live on the rim, it's just endlessly complex, and how can you know what's right? But if you can move to the hub, where even to the single point around which everything focuses, then you have the whole perspective is different. So I took this class in consciousness, assuming, because I was naive enough to think that everybody was like me, that the only thing we'd want to know was how to have the right consciousness. But that wasn't what it turned out to be at all. It was just this huge intellectual discussion about everybody's point of view about consciousness, what this one thought and that one thought, and this speaker and that one and this philosopher. And every time I try to just even ask the question, yes, but what about the experience that these different states produce? Which is the most desirable? I was told that wasn't even the point of the class. And I gave up my academic career in that first week. over that class to a large extent, a few other things, but that class was one of it. I am not where I want to be. And later, and it wasn't much later, that I found the principles of self-realization and soon after met Swami Kriyananda. These people want to change consciousness and find the right consciousness. They don't merely want to talk about it. And so Sanjaya in the Gita, explaining to Dhritarashtra, the blind mind, what was the outcome? The forces of materialism, represented by the Kauravas and Duryodhana, and the forces of righteousness, represented by Arjuna and the Pandavas, they clashed on the field of Kurukshetra, which is the inner reality. They went to war and went up against each other. What happened? And that's what we want to know. What happened? And the battle of Kurukshetra, as Swamiji has talked about it, of course, it's the inner consciousness. And at the end of every day, the blind mind, which is us, enamored of delusion, as Dhritarashtra was foolishly attached to his son Duryodhana, and his judgment, his discrimination was blinded by his attachment. And so our mind becomes blind by our attachments and our desires and our likes and dislikes. And we go through the course of a day, and at the end of each day we have to ask Sanjaya, who has the power to see clearly, the power of introspection, who won? In all my encounters today, between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who won? What was the outcome? Excuse me, I had a thought, but I think I'm losing it. I remember there was a period of time very early in my spiritual life when I was facing a lot of temptations to dilute my spiritual commitment. I won't say ever to leave it, because by the grace of God I've never been tempted to leave it. But I have been tempted many times to dilute it. Dilute the clear focus, dilute the energy, dissipate energy in ways that would be better not. And this was very early in my spiritual life, and I was caught up in a wave of dissipation. And when I would meditate in the morning, Sanjaya would be right there with me, and he would make very clear to me, what the outcome had been when I dissipated my energy. And I would be very strongly determined not to do it again. But I would have to say honestly to God and Guru, if you give me the opportunity, I will take it. So the only way that we can keep the right energy and have the Pandavas be victorious at the end of this day is that you don't tempt me. And it was so amusing because, and I would say, and as I know as I go out and am faced with the opportunity to dissipate my energy, I'm going to forget my resolution. So you have to protect me from the opportunity. And it would be so funny to me because he would. And even when I would try to create opportunities to dissipate my energy, those doors would close in front of me. It's quite a touching and complicated story. I would say that prayer that I would pray, don't please save me from the opportunity to dissipate, because if given it, I will do it. I think it's a little bit like saying to Krishna, drive my chariot, so that I may suggest that we go here or there, but keep the reins in your hands. And if you sincerely do, if given the choice you sincerely do, then he will. And you'll be so glad, even if in the moment you might argue a little, you'll still be very, very glad. So, now let me see. So now we are going to go to chapter 9 of this book, in which Sanjaya begins to explain to Dhritarashtra what he sees. These are the stanzas in the Gita. Now it's Sanjaya saying, okay, I'm looking at the field of battle, and this is what's happened so far. So, let me just find the right words. Yes, here we are. Now Duryodhana, now this is the story of the Mahabharata too. Duryodhana has usurped the kingdom. Duryodhana represents material desire. The kingdom rightfully belongs to the Pandavas because Yudhishthira, the oldest of the Pandava brothers, he has the right to inherit it. But Duryodhana has usurped it. And the image here, of course, is that, the firstborn is of spirit. We start, our consciousness is of the divine. And so the oldest reality within us, the true inheritor, is our divine consciousness. But when that point of spirit expands out to the rim of the wheel, our individual jiva gets engaged in all that's going on out here, and our inner reality is invaded by all these material desires, by all this belief in that we are separate. And in this first stanza, this question of the key delusion that holds all the other delusions together is egoic identification, that we, the infinite spirit, the jiva, which is an aspect of divinity and whose true nature is divine, Atman, is Brahma, the individual spirit is the infinite spirit. But we have identified, the ego identifies with all this diversity and loses its identification with the one. And once we have lost our identification with the one and identify with the diversity, then Duryodhana rules the kingdom. And the first stanza explains, Bhishma, the grandfather of both sides, it represents that ego identification. And as long as the ego can be kept intact, Duryodhana can rule the kingdom. But if anything happens to Bhishma, if the ego is dissolved, then immediately spirit returns, and spirit rules the kingdom. And so in the Gita stanzas, Duryodhana tries to protect his army, tries to tell his army, above all, surround Bhishma. He's leading the forces, and we must keep him from being killed by the spiritual forces. We must keep the ego from being dissolved by the spiritual forces, because if it's dissolved, we're absolutely finished. There's nothing to hold us together anymore after this. So Duryodhana goes out to look at the field, and he's a little dismayed because the Pandava force looks more impressive to him than he expected it to be. Now, there's also a subtle lesson here, which is, from the spiritual perspective, we can see both the spiritual side and the material side. But from the material perspective, they can't really see, they don't really understand the power of the spiritual side, which is why, interestingly, I was speaking of Jesus a moment ago. Spiritual people are always, virtually always, are always persecuted by other spiritual people. They're rarely persecuted, and I dare say probably never persecuted, by purely materialistic people, because worldly people don't see the threat that spiritual power presents to their position. Because they just don't live in that world. It's just exactly like Duryodhana thought Arjuna was foolish to take Krishna instead of Krishna's army. Clearly the power is in Krishna's army. What can one unarmed person do to help you compared to what this vast army could do to help me? And so material forces just don't understand that the origin point of all that material power is spiritual, and therefore it controls everything. They just keep working on the material plane. And so when Duryodhana goes and sees the Pandavas arrayed there with so much power, he becomes quite concerned all of a sudden. Where did all these forces come from? And his guru in battle is Drona. Now Drona is also the guru, the battle guru of the Pandava forces too. This is again why in all the different ways that we're shown that this is the war within one individual, not really with separate forces. What Drona represents, and Drona has been the as I say, the guru in arms for both the Pandavas and the Kauravas, what Drona represents is habit, past habit. He represents samskars. He represents all that we have already done. And spiritually speaking, habit tends to side with the material forces. And so Drona, even though Arjuna is his favorite, is in the army of Duryodhana, because past habit is what moves us to continue the way we're going. We've built up this karma, we've built up this inclination of likes and dislikes, we've built up these samskars that push us outward to the world, and at first, those samskars just keep us going in the way that we're going. And so Duryodhana is very alarmed by all of this that he sees on the Pandava side, and he rushes to Drona. He rushes to past habit. He rushes to his own samskars because he assumed that they would be powerful enough to defeat the spiritual forces. He doesn't understand that the spiritual habit in the end is actually much deeper. That the spiritual samskars in the end are fundamental to our consciousness. And even though the habit is there, and this also represents what happens to us when we first go into our into the silence of meditation. Because meditation has become so well known as a beneficial practice, so often I talk to people about it. Or, for example, I was in a taxi cab, and the driver was chatting with me, and he asked, "What do I do?" And my first and simplest explanation, I say, I teach meditation. I mean, I have a bigger world than simply that. Or I should say, that essential premise manifests in many more complicated ways, but that says enough. I teach meditation. Oh, the man said, I tried to meditate. He said, I couldn't do it at all. And I said, well, what did you do? Well, I went in a dark room and I sat there with my eyes closed. And nothing happened. Because the first thing that happens when we try to quiet the mind is that all of our materialistic samskars rush in. And so this gives Duryodhana, the king of all those material desires, the impression that he has more power over the spiritual. Because at first he does. And that's why meditation, even though eventually it becomes natural, almost everyone, unless they have, well, very powerful spiritual samskars that have already in previous lifetimes defeated the Kauravas, most people sit down and the power of habit takes over. I had a meditation class that I taught once, a beginning meditation class, and there was after the first week everybody came back to talk, and I said, well, how did it go? And it was so interesting to me. There were 6 or 7 people who spoke, and each one of them expressed a particular, for them, almost insurmountable distraction that assailed them as soon as they sat to meditate. One of them said, I became very sad as soon as I started to meditate. Another said, I became angry. Another one said, I became hungry. Another one said, I became physically uncomfortable. Another said, I became anxious that I wasn't doing it correctly. And it was just like, it was a chronicle of Duryodhana's soldiers, all the ones that will come in as soon as you try to side with the Pandavas, and the battle of Kurukshetra within you begins. And each person, as we discussed it, was really talking, what attacked them was a central samskar that always attacks them. An inclination, a suppressed anger, this constant sense that somebody's doing something to me and it unsettles me that they're doing it to me, or anxiety that I'm not doing it correctly, this constant feeling of inadequacy in the face of life's challenges, or just hunger. I'm always wanting to gratify my sensual desires or dull my consciousness by pulling my energy down to my digestive system, whatever it might be. But that's Drona. That's the power of habit. And the power of materialistic habit can usually be relied upon to defeat the Pandavas on the battle of Kurukshetra. And Duryodhana is counting on Drona to make it work for him. So when he looks out and sees the array of the Pandava soldiers, much stronger than he knew were there, he becomes quite concerned. Swami Kriyananda has talked about the present level of development of our society at this time, and the transition from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga, the ascension from a more materialistic age into a more enlightened age, but the conflict, the transition we're in now. And Swami has talked about this population that's been quietly but conscientiously and with a great deal of power building a little bit under the radar of society as a whole. Spiritual awakening, attunement, ecological attunement with nature, Ananda itself with its communities, Yogananda's influence through Autobiography of a Yogi and through the inspiring ideas that his consciousness is planting in people's minds, either with their awareness of him or even when they're not even aware of him, that all of this Dwapara Yuga energy is building. But on the surface, Kali Yuga energy still rules. Politics, military machines, money, greed, corruption. And the spiritual people are perfectly aware of those corrupting forces. And we can see that they have power. But the corrupting forces really don't take us very seriously. They don't really think that the tree huggers or the meditators really have any influence. And Swamiji has predicted that those Kali Yuga forces of greed and destruction and careless disregard of divine law will gradually cause a collapse on many levels to that aspect of society. And when they have neutralized each other and to a certain extent neutralized a lot of the structures of society that we're presently living in, then out of the ashes, apparent ashes, the spiritual force will rise. And the remaining material people committed to that reality will be stunned at the power that's here, because the materialism does not understand the power of spirit, but spirit understands both sides. And this is also what's being represented here, when Duryodhana at first is quite dismayed, and he rushes to Drona and says, you promised to help me. You have to make this work for me. Just a moment here. Let me just find where I want to say. And so he attempts to give himself strength by listing out all the qualities that he has on his side. It's like the materialistic person, when threatened, goes in and counts all its assets and all its levels of security. And again, bear in mind, this is exactly what happens to the devotee. You sit down to meditate, and then all these materialistic forces come in, and they list themselves out for you, all the things that you have and want, and in an attempt to prove that spirituality is no threat. I can hold this fortress. And this is the war, the battle of Kurukshetra, that the Gita tells us how to fight. So thank you. God bless you. And we'll continue in the next session.